Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Melissa Hafaf. I'm the Executive Director for the Gender Justice Initiative here at Georgetown University. For those who are not familiar with us, we are a cross-campus effort that supports research, programs, dialogue around intersectional gender justice. And we're very excited to welcome you today for this book talk with Professor Boum Make. And to discuss this new book that you can get, by the way, outside if you didn't get your coffee. I know she didn't want us to promote that much, but I think you need to get the book, obviously, right? This makes sense. This is a book talk, Jen. So yeah, don't forget to get your coffee outside. For now, so I'll give you a bit of the rundown of the program. First, we'll start with a presentation by Professor Boum Make on the book, and then we'll have a discussion, moderated discussion, and then it will be a group discussion, actually, or a small group discussion. So it will be very interactive. And now let me introduce you to Professor Boum Make. She's currently an assistant professor in the French and Francophone Studies Department here at Georgetown, and soon to be associate professor. Her scholarship engages the literatures and cultures of the French overseas territories, the legacy of colonialism, medical humanities, and care studies. She's also the co-editor, I feel like this microphone, sorry. She's also the co-editor of graphic narratives of resistance, advocating for representation and social justice in French language bande dessinée, which is graphic novels, comic books, published last year by Edinburgh University Press. And her new research project continues to explore questions of health, coloniality, and women's well-being across transoceanic contexts. So we're very proud to celebrate this book and discuss this book, this very important contribution. And it couldn't be more timely. As you know, there's a lot of debates around care, who receives care, who is denied care, who is expected to provide care. And it often shapes conversations around gender, race, inequality, environment. So there's a lot of layers to this conversation. I'm very excited for it. And this book also provides a framework to even think about more creative ways to resist these inequalities that Professor Boum Make will be talking about and imagine more transformative alternatives. So we will begin with the presentation, as I said, and after that, Professor Lauren Arrington, who is also a Georgetown professor, an assistant professor and the Susan H. Mayer Endowed Professor in Health Equity at our Georgetown University Berkeley School of Nursing, will be moderating the conversation. And we're especially grateful for your presence and your expertise in health equity. And also, Professor Arrington is a former Gender Justice Initiative Fellow. So we're also excited and proud of that. And also a brief note for anybody here who is a Georgetown faculty, student, staff. Our call for proposal is out there. It's open. Go on our website. So if you want to be part of the next cohort, it's a fellowship that supports all kinds of research that has to do with intersectional gender justice. And it's a year-long program building an intellectual community and giving a lot of tools for research. And before we begin, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Women's and Gender Studies Program, the Department of Black Studies, the Global Health Institute, the Department of French and Francophone Studies, the Berkeley School of Nursing, and the Medical Humanities Initiative for supporting this program. And I also want to thank our team, especially Coco Tate, our program director, and Lauren Burns, our student assistant. Where's Lauren? Oh, she's here. She's sitting, like, because you're always. So thank you for all the thought that you put into this event. And thank you for all being here to listen, to reflect, to engage with us. And please join me in welcoming Professor Jennifer Boum Make.
Thank you, Melissa, for this generous introduction. And thank you for everyone for being here. Thank you, Lauren. So grateful for this partnership. I'm so grateful that we've met, and it's all thanks to you. So really thank you for the Gender Justice Initiative and all the sponsors that you've listed. I'm really delighted to see such a strong presence today, and I hope that we can engage in conversation afterwards. I'm just going to give you a half-hour talk approximately, and then, as Melissa said, we'll be in conversation around key concepts that we'd like to engage with and hopefully, propose to you as well. And then we'll try to also do more interactive breakout conversations around ideas of care and decoloniality. So first, I'd like to contextualize and define more clearly the concept of care by referencing the wider corpus that I engage with in my book, Decolonial Care, Reimagining Caregiving in the French Caribbean. I'm going to then situate the term within the context of the French Caribbean, showing a few of the ways dynamics of caregiving have been shaped by the enduring legacies of colonialism and slavery, and the role of text to represent but also engage with said dynamics. And finally, I will situate the intersection of care and decoloniality around Anjal and Sophie Adriansen's graphic narrative, Outre-mer, Overseas Mothers, I guess would be a translation from the French, which focuses on the question of reproductive violence against women, in particular the racialized public policies in Réunion, which were enforced and led to forced abortions and sterilization on thousands of non-white women, starting in 1966 and continuing well into the 1970s, and all of this against the backdrop of aggressive pro-natalist policy in hexagonal France. Just to give you a sense of the geography that I'm engaging with here, you can see what I call hexagonal France at the center of this map. That's actually, it's not wanted, but like here it is. You can then see the overseas territories. So my primary research engages with the French Caribbean, which is going to include Guadeloupe and Martinique. And then Réunion is a region that's in the Indian Ocean, and I'm newly engaging with that context. So when we talk about care, what do we talk about? What comes to mind? So we can start by a basic dictionary search of the term, and you can find that it's synonymous with a bunch of other words like attention, carefulness, conscientiousness, lovingness, kindness, solicitude, and the list goes on. And that's really just the first layer of understanding of care, and that's probably the less complicated and more optimistic way of seeing care. And actually, when you start looking at the etymology of the word, care actually derives from the Old English caru, which means grief, anxiety, and sorrow, and maybe speaks already to the ways to complicate care. And so care studies, the field of care studies, foreground a critical analysis of practices of care which are historically entangled with neglect, oppression, and the systemic invisibilization of people along gender, racial, class, and geographic lines. So just to situate the scholarly debates in care studies, the concept of care appears as early as the 1980s in North America, with the seminal work by US psychologist Carol Gilligan in A Different Voice. This text really identifies for us the primarily gendered division of caring, whether unpaid or underpaid, as well as its systemic and systematic devaluation. So in A Different Voice, Carol Gilligan features interviews that she conducted with girls to study their moral development and conception of morality. So she uses Lawrence Kohlberg's Heinz dilemma, where a man has to decide whether to steal a drug to save his wife's life. And Gilligan shows that in this situation, when the girls are presented with this dilemma, a lot of them would tend to think about the possible consequences of the choice. So instead of focusing on an abstract idea of justice, which would center on keeping the wife alive in the present moment, the girl would worry about what might go wrong, like Heinz getting caught and going to jail, no longer being able to take care of his wife, which could eventually make things worse. So Gilligan writes in A Different Voice, and I'm quoting here, asked if Heinz should steal the drug, she replies in a way that seems evasive and unsure. Well, I don't think so. I think there might be other ways besides stealing it, like if he could borrow the money or make a loan or something, but he really shouldn't steal the drug, but his wife shouldn't die either. Asked why he should not steal the drug, she considers neither property nor law, but rather the effect that theft could have on the relationship between Heinz and his wife. If he stole the drug, he might save his wife then, but if he did, he might have to go to jail. And then his wife might get sicker again, and he couldn't get more of the drug, and it might not be good. So they should really just talk it out and find some other way to make the money. End of quote. So the different voice that's theorized by Gilligan focuses on the potential failing responsibility of Heinz, and therefore it shows concern for their relationship and the woman's health in the long term. So that's not so much a naturalization of care, making it women's moral realm, but rather a way to call attention to and into question the deep-seated feminization of care in the gendering of social relations. So one that reinforces the relegation of caring responsibilities to women and girls, whether in domestic settings such as child rearing or home maintenance, or in caregiving professions. So one last point about this is that in Kohlberg's study, girls' responses to the dilemma are actually set in contrast with boys' reliance on what Gilligan calls the formal logic of fairness that informs the justice approach, which is typically associated with men's moral judgment at the time. So in this framework, abstract logic is understood broadly and it's valorized, while socially, culturally constructed care-oriented dispositions are devalued and marginalized. So just to sum up Gilligan's reasoning here for us, the early conceptualization of care basically means that it's the final stage of moral development for women, and that's just another way to devaluate women in society. So building on this study of the gendering and devaluation of care, scholars like John Tronto and Berenice Fisher in the 1990s shift attention to the politicization of care. They really try to emphasize the public visibility of care. And they define care as a moral imperative that shows that caring activities have always been essential to the maintenance of our societies, beyond just the domestic and the private spheres. And so that's the definition that they give for us to define care. And I'm just quoting here. So caring is viewed here as species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so we can live in it as well as possible. And so making care visible as a central feature of our societies also means to take a step back and to start questioning the inequalities in caregiving dynamics. So that would be within the family setting, but also work relations, caregiving professions. So that basically means that you start looking at who provides care, who receives it, and how the persistent devaluation of care has contributed to a care crisis or fracture, which in context closer to us might sound familiar in the context of what we've seen during the COVID pandemic. So following this, you find this particular focus on not only the gendered organization of caring activities, but also class-based, racial-based, and geographic-based organization of care. So in Moral Boundaries that you see here, that was published in 1993, Tronto observes, for example, and I'm quoting here, that care has mainly been the work of slaves, servants, and women in Western history. In What is Care, the second one here, Pascal Molinier, Sandra Logier, and Patricia Pepperman similarly insist on the fact that, and I'm quoting, translating here, care tasks have been relegated to those who had already been denied the rights to full citizenship, specifically slaves, indentured workers, immigrants, and women. So here, categories of individuals are amalgamated to form the group of subalterns that Fabienne Brugère, who's another leading voice in care studies, identifies in the ethics of care as the caregiving labor force par excellence. And so at this point of my work, I think what really struck me and eventually nourished the project was first a tendency to amalgamate the historical care workforce. So it's just kind of like groups of people that are all called subalterns and that basically are tasked to care for others to maintain good life. And the second thing that really called my attention was the fact that in Caribbean literature, there's many figuration of caregiving characters, most of them women. And so just to give you a couple of examples to present a corpus that I'm engaging with and that really resonate with those caregiving roles, you find, for instance, Gouverneur de la Rosée, so Masters of the Dew, a novel by a Haitian writer, where you find two characters, so the mother and the wife, that are basically unflinching advocates to Manuel, who is a self-sacrificing male hero who's tasked to save the Fond Rouge community. Another interesting novel is La Rue Cazeneuve by Martinican Joseph Zobel. And so in this novel, you find the hardworking character of the grandmother who's working day in and night out on the plantation, cutting sugarcane to build a future away from the plantation for her grandson. And the last example that I'm giving here is Gisèle Pineau's exile, according to Julia, which again shows the character of the grandmother, who's basically silenced and taken away by her son and brought forcefully to hexagonal France. So on all counts, to quote Kayama Glover in A Regard Itself, Caribbean women have been configured in regional fiction as infinitely willing and expected to orient themselves in service to communities or partners, children, and aging parents that are little attentive to their individual needs and desires. So more specific then to the context of colonial enslavement, the activities that define care were a commodified resource, and the existence of caregivers was thereby incorporated into colonial exploitation. So that's what Françoise Vergès, who is a politologue, calls an economy of exhaustion, a direct result of the extraction of labor. So as part of the plantation system, in the then official French colonies of Guadeloupe and Martinique, the enslaved were working the land and caring for the master's family and maintaining the household. And on the colonial plantation, another interesting thing to note here is the fact that Black women's wombs, and that's again thanks to the work of Françoise Vergès here, she reminds us that Black women's wombs were made into capital and their children were transformed into currency. And that's following the Black Codes of 1685, especially Article 13, that says that Black women that were giving birth to a child, the child was actually also enslaved. So that's kind of like contributing to this economy, this colonial economy that's exploiting women's lives and also the life of their children. So the coercive and extractive practices that supported the organization of work on the colonial plantation mean that daily activities that were maintaining life for others, in short, free labor, had become what I call colonized acts of caring. So through this, I wish to highlight the dialectical relation between the amplification of care on the one hand and its absence, denial, or depletion on the other. So caring and uncaring, which is not to care, as two sides of the same coin. And in fact, prolonged and extensive practices of neglect and endangerment of human and non-human lives have come to define the relationship between hexagonal France and its overseas territories, well beyond the end of formal colonial rule. And for instance, one may think here of state-sponsored pollution with chlordécone that happened between the years 1972 and 1993, where France, in full knowledge of the toxicity of this pesticide, chose to use that pesticide on plantation, contaminating waterways, land, and of course, human and non-human life. Another thing that we can think about is the nuclear bombing in French Polynesia that took place between 1966 and 1996, and the consequences of radioactive fallout on the lives of French Polynesians today. And another example that I'm going to be discussing later is the example of reproductive violence in Réunion between the years 1960s and 1970s. So all of these realities, even though they come from specifically different local contexts, highlight a clear gap between the hexagonal and extra-hexagonal territories, showing that in the French national imagination, there is a unique historical and cultural distinction established between the hexagon and the overseas territories, a distinction that has throughout history been used to pass off as acceptable what happens outside the hexagon. So studying the kind of care that emerges from the condition of enduring violence, I'm usually in conversation with French scholar Elsa Dorlin, who proposes the concept of dirty care that I find quite interesting because it emphasizes the forms of attention to others that result from the constant threat of the destruction of one's own existence. So the need to care in that sense, in a society that is defined by violence, is actually negative because it means to live like a prey. It means to be continually on one's guard, and it means, in the words of Dorlin here, to be concerned for others in order to anticipate what they want or can do to us, which might devalue, exhaust, insult, isolate, injure, worry, deny, frighten, or derealize us. So in this context, this kind of attention to others takes shape out of concern for one's own survival. It arises by and within means of violence. So I think Dorlin really helps us think about the forms of concern for others that come out of a social system that is defined by violence. Care here means not to take responsibility for the self and others, but rather to invalidate the self, for it is constrained and defined by the necessity to avoid the persecutors or prepare for conflict. So for the oppressed, then, maintaining life in repressive contexts, to use the same terminology as in Fisher and Tronto's definition, means maintaining safety. And I think this is where a decolonial methodology becomes really helpful. So for me, it's about reorienting what care could look like. It means to basically first shift the focus, so to move away from those who wield power to focus on those who are subjected to it. And second, it means to elucidate and reimagine manifestations of care through texts. And I'll come back to this decolonial approach in the second part of the talk, but by way of a conclusion to this first section, I'll just briefly highlight some of the texts and the contexts that I show and engage with in the book. So just to give you a brief overview here, I take as my point of departure 8 different texts that encompass both visual and textual forms and allow me to engage with different manifestations and understanding of care. So the first one is curation as caring, and I'm in conversation with the curatorial discourses of the exhibit in Paris, Black Models, and I put this in dialogue with a novel by Fabienne Canor, who's a Martinican writer, Hummus. The second context that I look at is domestic service, and I engage with Françoise Ega's memoir, Letters to a Black Woman, and also Jessica Oublié and Marie-Ange Rousseau's graphic narrative, Pays en nous. The third context that I highlight is nurturing human and non-human life as well as environments through an analysis of Gisèle Pineau's novel Morne Capresse and also Jessica Oublié's and colleagues' graphic narrative Tropique Toxique or Toxic Tropics, was just translated in English last year. And the fourth context is care-focused gender roles. And for this, I look at, again, Canor, another of Canor's novels, D'eau douce, of Fresh Waters, and Gaël Octavia's novel, The Good Story of Madeleine Demetrius. So that's just to give you a sense of how the book is organized. So as you may notice here, for those who are in literary studies, or even if not, my approach to text is really broad. I engage with medium specificity within individual chapters, but my overarching focus is on narratives that explore the tension between the enduring impact of colonial harm and the possibilities for reimagining caregiving in the present and for the future. So through this collection of texts, I hope to recenter the impact of uncaring in the French Caribbean, shedding light on the lives and habitats burdened by the relentless demand for care while receiving none or very little, as well as to discern practices of care that challenge this historical legacy. So that implies that my corpus really reflects a reading practice that tends to the many ways through which both caring and uncaring can materialize textually. So that study also makes clear that attempts at caregiving are not always successful, and that's really something I want to point out here, like not everything happening in those books is actually always optimistic. It's rarely straightforward, and I think it's probably because it's wrestling with the persistent legacy of colonialism and slavery, and it's actually difficult to think about care in those contexts, right? So now I'd like to further explore the intersection of care and decoloniality in the context of a new project that I've tentatively titled Transoceanic Narratives of Women's Ill and Well-Being, Decoloniality, Healthcare, and the French Overseas Territories. So this study builds on the historical, racial, gendered, and geographic asymmetries in the distribution of care across the French Overseas Territories. It's not limited to the French Caribbean in that sense, and it's centering the bodies and voices of women, which are too often ignored or erased within narratives emerging from already marginalized territories. So for this, I build on the conceptual and historical groundwork that I've established in Decolonial Care, and I focus more specifically on narratives and representations of women's health and experiences of ill and well-being in the French overseas. So in this new project, I aim to trace the persistent fractures in care that continue to impede or delay access to well-being for marginalized populations across the overseas, while also exploring how artistic and literary practices can reclaim and reimagine the language and practices of care themselves. And so that's how I try to weave decolonial methodology into my work. I try to propose an inquiry into texts that both open space for reckoning with intrinsically uncaring practices inherited from colonial rule, while also illuminating sites and practices of repair, always in this kind of dual movement. So this inquiry insists on a reimagining of what care might be or could become beyond its distorted and abusive definitions within the colony and its afterlives. So terms such as reimagining, reclaiming, and repairing function here not as resolutions, but more like interrogations. We're interrogating the possibility to repair, the possibility to reclaim. And I think this is where I situate this decolonial methodology. So just to give you a brief overview of how that methodology actually works, I'm just going to look briefly at some panels from the graphic narrative I was telling you about, overseas mothers, the scandal of forced abortions in Réunion. So this graphic narrative follows two fictional characters. First, there is Lucie, that you can see here in the top panel, who's pregnant with her seventh wanted child, but finds herself subjected to a non-consensual abortion at the Clinique de Saint-Benoît Clinic, which was run by Dr. David Moreau. And this woman, as a result of this operation, was left infertile. And so after much difficulty, she finally finds the courage to speak out and take legal action against the doctor in reference to the Procès des 30 Courageuses, the trial of the 30 brave women that took place in 1971. So that's where 30 women sought justice against the doctors who had sterilized them without informing them of the procedures. And so Lucie's story happens against the backdrop, on top of this, of an intense gendered and racialized framing of public policy around reproductive health. So following French demographer Alfred Sauvy, in the 50s, this guy actually conceptualized the idea of the human bomb, la bombe humaine, which was basically casting population growth in the newly called third world as being uncontrolled, right? So they're using that colonial interpretation of population growth to then basically control and abuse women's bodies in Réunion. So in the words of the prime minister at the time, Michel Debré, who was the prime minister under Charles de Gaulle, the guy basically said and wrote, like you can find this in official documents, that what they were going to do in Réunion was meant to control as quickly as possible the demographic tidal wave that threatens to overwhelm everything. The tidal wave being another interpretation of the bombe humaine de Sauvy. So similarly, the same colonial logic of demographic control has been used to justify migration programs such as the Bumidum, which was a state-organized migration from the overseas departments, so from Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Réunion, that took place between 63 and 82. And so basically, this program was meant to attract young Martinicans, Guadeloupeans, and Réunionnese men and women to go work into hexagonal France at a time where you had a lot of independence movements in those regions. So that was a way to basically annihilate any attempt at independence and also to deplete the population of the French overseas territories. And so more specific to Réunion, Myriam Paris notes in 1963 that Debré basically, when he was elected deputy of Réunion, he sent a team of doctors to the island tasked with popularizing contraceptive methods, although this initiative violated legal restrictions. So you have to know that in 1920s, there was a law that was passed in France that was basically banning anti-pregnancy, anti-abortion. Like, it was basically the opposite that was taking place in Réunion, right? So in Réunion, they were popularizing contraception and abortion, while in France, they were basically circulating pro-natalist policies. And you can see this here. That's the official poster, and you find this poster reproduced within the graphic narrative. And so on that particular poster, for those of you who don't read French, it's just saying assez, so enough. And that was sponsored by l'Association Réunionnaise d'Orientation Familiale that was created in 1966. And so this type of historical documents is in fact reproduced in the graphic narrative and often crowding the page, as you can see here. So on this page here, the frame is completely gone. You can see the characters in very small format here on the page. And you can also see a couple of other advertisements that were popular at the time. And actually, so the first one is saying heureux pas trop d'enfants, so happy, not too many children. And the second one is saying mom, 2 is enough. And so those 2 flyers are repeated respectively 3 and 4 times on a single page only. So that's really here showing you the aggressive nature of a highly saturated pro-contraception campaign in Réunion. And so the second character that you have in the graphic narrative is on the right here. And so that's Marianne. She's a young woman living in Paris. She secretly has an abortion, and she later joins the early feminist movement, the MLF, which is the Movement for the Liberation of Women. And all of this happens also around the time of the publication of a manifesto in France that's called the Manifesto of the 343 sluts, yes. Which was basically a manifesto that was published by Le Nouvel Observateur, which is a newspaper, it's still a newspaper today, that was trying to promote abortion for women. And that's also at the time of what we call the Bobigny trial, which took place in 1972. And that was a trial that was where Gisèle Halimi, a very important lawyer at the time, and her legacy lives on also today, was basically defending women, 5 women, including 1 girl who had been raped and was accused of seeking abortion after her rape. So you can really see here the context in which hexagonal France finds itself at the time in complete dissonance with what's happening in Réunion. So by putting these 2 stories next to each other, the comic makes it clear that reproductive control is both gendered and racialized, as we know. Yet both are about controlling women's bodies, but that control plays out differently along lines of race, of class, and of geography. So more than just highlighting the intersectionality of oppression, I think the graphic narrative really creates moments of reading and visual dissonance. It's basically interruptions that interfere with or even disrupt the story of the struggle for the legalization of abortion in hexagonal France and the MLF's actions. So this visual and textual grammar pushes back against a mutilated cartography that ignores the suffering of thousands of women, and that counters what Vergès calls an epistemology of ignorance. And that epistemology of ignorance means that there's basically this privilege of comfortable and dismissive forgetfulness that is embedded in Republican post-coloniality and that continues to uphold colonial violence and oppression. So yes, you see the struggle over reproductive rights against policies that restricted contraception and abortion, but the graphic narrative forces the fracturing of this nationalization of the story. That means that we're basically paying attention to how attention was unevenly distributed and how some history were being left out. And there's 2 levels of interference that I'd like to show you, and I'll just finish with this. The first one is very circumstantial. You can see 2 realities happening at the same time, but not directly intersecting. So there's Marianne that I introduced earlier, who's on a family holiday to Réunion. She's basically at what looks like a beach resort here. And you can see on the left-hand side, one of the hotel staff that's looking at a newspaper, témoignage, that's with the headline, Nous accusons, we accuse, and that's in reference to what was going on at the clinic at the time. And so just a few moments later, he walks over to the family and he's just handing them drinks, and you can see them like lounging on the beach, completely unaware of what's going on in Réunion at the time. The second level of interference that I find more overt, like more straightforward, comes across as I would say, an accusation of willful ignorance, or at least deliberate dismissal. So, for instance, here, Marianne is reading the newspaper again, Le Monde, which is highlighting the fact that the abortions were basically financed by the Social Security system. Of course, taxpayers were not aware of this because it was usually listed as appendicitis, for instance. So women would go in to get surgery for appendicitis, and they would come out and they would find themselves having lost their baby or having been sterilized. And so she's realizing this, and she's basically bringing this back to her and saying, oh my God, like, for me, that was really difficult to get abortion in France. That's not fair. That's the first reaction that she has to the news that she reads. And the second one that you see here is a conversation with a friend of hers, and she's basically sharing an article. Again, it's a lot of newspapers in this. So sharing an article on abortions at the Saint-Benoît clinic, and she's basically suggesting that the movement for the liberation of women in hexagonal France should organize something for it. And so her friend basically just dismisses what she says and says, well, Réunion, it's a bit far, no? And again, you can see that there's this, basically, there's this possibility from hexagonal France to just not care for the lives of people who are perceived as distant others. And so here I contend that this reflects a deeper colonial distribution of attention. So who and what is cared for and who and what is ignored is organized along a colonial map of caring and uncaring that really intersects with gender, with race, and with geography. And so as we come toward the end of this book talk, I want to just bring back here the idea, the notion of decolonial methodology. And I want to show how decolonizing care and the texts that guide this method opens new ways of imagining care itself, especially through the acts of repair and healing. And so basically, I'm trying to conceptualize care not so much as oppression anymore, but as repair. And I think this shift from oppression to repair is where we can locate this decolonial methodology. And so I just want to leave us with a few thoughts on the narrative strategies, both visual and textual, that capture, center, and embody women's physical and psychological trauma and grief over the violent loss of a child or the loss of the ability to become pregnant. So the story world of Lucy is one that I think shapes our understanding of repair, especially in contexts where the formal justice systems had failed. And I just want to think back then to the trial of the 30 brave women, where you have to be aware that on appeal, the plaintiffs were dismissed. So 5 of the 6 doctors, all male, from mainland France, 5 of them white, 1 from Morocco, were acquitted, while the male nurse from Réunion received a 1-year sentence and a fine. And the Dr. Moreau that I was mentioning earlier was never investigated, and the women never received reparation. So I think it's through the telling, or rather imagining, of Lucy's experience of loss that new spaces of care and negotiation of grief might emerge. So for example, chronologically here, soon after she comes back from the clinic, Lucy encounters a pregnant woman on the street. And in the next panel, we see her face, tears welling in her eyes. Later, we see a moment of intimate closeness between her and her sister, and that's the middle panel here. Nicole apologizes for the healthy progress of her pregnancy, with tears in her eyes, and in response, Lucy offers reassurance, supporting her sisters in ways that shape their emotional, bodily, and communal negotiation of well, but also of ill-being. And in the final panel that you see here, Lucy is holding her sister Nicole's newborn baby. And I believe that here she's offered, at least briefly, a space of respite and perhaps even solace. And I think these small, intimate acts, these gestures of care, become what I think of as decolonial acts within these narratives. So basically, what would it mean to tell these stories from a place of ill, but also well-being, from voices that emerge out of sites that have long been invisibilized, neglected, or abused? What would the path toward healing and repair look like in those circumstances? And that's exactly where I situate my decolonial approach to care, and that's the lens that I'm bringing to this new project. Thank you so much for your attention. Okay.
was amazing. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Professor Make, for taking us through this journey. What should I, do you want me to call you Jennifer? Okay.
This is one of the like introduce people to what we envisioned. Yeah, that sounds great. So we basically thought to go ahead around some of the terms that appear in the book. So we have a few of those notions highlighted here. Uncaring, rebellious care, the world below, and then healing and repair. Thank you. And so we're going to try to give you definitions for those terms. And I think the idea is really to see how we could bridge our respective fields. So we're going to give you examples of what we mean by uncaring, for instance, what we mean by rebellious care. And hopefully you'll see the ways in which the humanities, the medical humanities, the sciences can kind of like be in conversation with each other. So uncaring, as you have gathered probably from the talk, it's any forms of that show a depletion, an absence of care, that show forms of neglect, that is basically an interpretation of care as oppression, right? And so when I think of uncaring, and I've already given some of those examples to you, I think usually from what the government of France has done to those overseas territories over the years, where you see the colonial legacies of oppression, where you really see forms of neglect to human life, to non-human life, to the maintaining of life. You really see the impossibility to maintain life, the difficulty to maintain life in those spaces. And so the examples that I like to think with, I've already mentioned. It's really the chlordecone pollution. That's more recent history for us, maybe. The fact that French Polynesia was bombed for 20 years, leading to radioactive pollution, cancer becoming literally a transgenerational illness that a lot of people have, die from, suffer from in this region. And the last context is really just in conversation with what you've seen here in Réunion in the case of reproductive violence. And so one of the other things that I'm engaging with in relation to uncaring, and I think that might be tapping into what you're going to talk about, is the fractured landscapes of care that you find across hexagonal France and the French overseas territory. So what you need to know is that in a lot of cases, there is basically an inability for people to receive care in their respective regions. So for instance, still to this day, 6% of people living in Martinique and Guadeloupe have to leave the French Caribbean to receive treatment in hexagonal France. So there is no facilities or infrastructure built to enable people to stay in their living and home, in their living spaces, and receive care. So that's one thing. Another thing that you see is also the fact that not just that, there's actual limitations even when you're staying within your region. So a lot of times you find that people don't really have had the opportunity to even know about the forms of medical attention that they need to receive. So you see a lot of misinformation, disinformation around health. That's another key aspect of a form of violence that continues to shape this landscape of care. So I think that's one way to maybe think around uncaring, at least for me.
Thank you. And I want to highlight, just as I get started with uncaring, that part of our coming together was really around you wanting us to take these concepts and this journey that you've gone on through the literature to really help us understand how care and uncaring functions in our society, in our world, in our economies, and to look at our own work and look at our own lives and our own realities and think about how can we apply this concept of decolonizing care to our lives. And so I really appreciate that. And as a midwife and someone who provides care and works with care systems, it's so relevant. And you give us a window to better understand what's happening in these very complex systems that we work within. And so some of the ways I see uncaring show up in my work. And I want to also highlight that I have some of my colleagues here with me today. I have Cristina Moreira, who is an amazing midwife and researcher who does a lot of great work around creating systems that are more caring, particularly for communities that have experienced a significant neglect and extraction of their ability to care for themselves. And I also have Eden Mogt here, who's also working with us on Christina's research team. And so we see a lot of neglect in our healthcare system, where even just the way that healthcare is structured, particularly in certain parts of the world and in certain communities, it can be dramatically different in terms of what type of care is available, the staffing, the support when there's an emergency, and just the desire to meet people's needs. We see blame narratives, which I think really connects with what you were talking about in terms of populations, where all of a sudden this population's too large, it has a problem, and we have to fix that. And in Black maternal health, we see a lot of narratives around Black women just being innately sicker. They come in and they're sicker than the other patients, and so we accept that they are going to have poor outcomes, as opposed to appreciating all the structures and systems and racism and history that has contributed to that. We also see that caregivers don't receive care, and that really impedes their ability to care for others. And I think that's particularly important in nations that have faced colonization, that have faced extraction of resources, and where people are not paid appropriately, not staffed well enough in the healthcare system. And so they really struggle to deliver the care that they want to give because they're not taken care of. And then there's a lot of interpersonal disrespect. So all that we see on the macro level then manifests on the very much on the interpersonal level.
Thank you so much for that. That really just ties in a lot of the situations that you encounter. And I think that probably resonates with a lot of us today, and even in our interactions with the medical system, right? So the second term that we wanted to propose to you is rebellious care. And I think actually we have had this conversation before, and we had different interpretations of what rebellious care is, because the way that I used the term originally is basically thinking from a term that's coming from the Creole, that is potomitan. So potomitan is basically the central pillar of the voodoo temple, that is the one that is holding the temple together, right? And that conception of strength, of resilience, is one that is applied to a lot of Caribbean women and a lot of Black women, actually, where they have this expectation to remain strong, this expectation to remain resilient, to silence their needs, their suffering, their pain. And in the book, I use this term to basically show the effects, the dramatic effects of rebellion, of this rebelling against this, right? So there's one text specifically, one novel, where a young Black woman is receiving those teachings from her mother, and she's basically having this crisis where she's rejecting her mother's teachings to be strong, to be resilient. And the result of this actually is quite bloody, because she kills her male partner, a Black man with whom she wanted to reimagine relationships. She wanted to cure, she wanted to heal the couple, but she failed to do that because of this overbearing burden of resilience, of strength. And then she commits suicide in the novel. And so that was, for me, a very deviant, bloody form of care, a care that is distorted within a system that is violent. And so that was my first understanding of rebellious care. And I think when we talked about quite the opposite, which is kind of more hopeful, which is, well, what are the ways to rebel against all of those forms of care that are oppressive, that are silencing a lot of people's lives, that are doing a lot of harm. And so to situate rebellion as a positive act, right? So that means that then rebelling against those systems is a form of rebellious care, which means like everything else that you do as an aside, as an alternative, as a transformation of the care that you receive or not receive. And so one example that I had about this, and that's something that I've started to work on, is a grouping of associations that you find across the French overseas territories. It's called the Fédération Amazon. It's a grouping of women who basically come together around their cancer stories, their cancer health journeys. And so they're basically trying to fill the gap, fill the institutional medical gap in the overseas territories by providing alternative forms of care to women. So that means non-medicalized forms of care. So that means that they're going to create spaces where women can come together, can actually talk about what they're experiencing, but also trying to reconcile women's relationship with the medical. So that means that they're very much aware of this sort of distrust that a lot of people have when they come into this medical institution, and is trying to basically encourage women to reimagine what those relationships can be, to really make peace, basically, with a very violent or oppressive system. And that could be maybe the other side of rebellious care, right?
Yeah, I definitely think it can be very positive. It is a reaction to oppression. And so sometimes with that, it leads us to do things we don't want to do. And you made me think of a novel, Night Wherever We Go, by Tracy Rose Payton, where she tells the story of a group of enslaved Black women who conspire to not get pregnant and to resist getting pregnant and to abort pregnancies by using natural remedies under enslavement as a way to really rebel against this economy of reproduction and forcing them to reproduce against their will. And so that might be something they would never want to do outside of enslavement, but they're kind of forced to do it. It also makes me think of the ways that women and birthing people and health workers try to, in little ways, challenge the oppressive systems of care. And been working with Christina on a study where we interviewed Black birthing women about their postpartum care and also health workers. And some of the things we tried to really uplift, what do they do to care for themselves in their community? Sometimes it's finding providers that look like them, or it is creating circles of sisters themselves, or for healthcare providers, sometimes it's working through lunch so they can provide excellent care, not turning people away when they are late. And I really like how you pointed out how resilience can be so problematic and so weaponized and used to justify harm and say that, oh, this group is so resilient, as if they should need to be resilient and not addressing the thing that is causing them to have to be resilient. And in talking with women, they don't want to be resilient. A lot of people, they want to be cared for and nurtured.
And that brings us to the third concept that we have, which is the world below, which is here, which is a complicated, tumultuous, violent world. And we still have to make do and cope and like transform this world as best we can. And the way I was engaging with the world below originally was, again, with a novel. I'm always thinking through novels. So in this novel, Mort de Capresse, there is a community of women, congregation that they call themselves, that choose to basically remove themselves from the world. They're just like giving up on this world. They're just like trying to just create something else, create something that's different, and they just evade to a mountain, which is a hill, very distinctive geography of the Caribbean, and they try to reimagine care, right? Care for themselves, care for the land. They try to grow a garden. They try to build self-sustaining ways to maintain community. And eventually, we actually see that a lot of the ways inherited from the world below actually start to hijack their project, right? And they're basically forced to come back to the world below, and there's the downfall of this utopian or dystopian community. And so I think then a lot of the time we actually have to think through this world below, which is here, right? To then actually address the issues that we see in our work, in our relationships, in any kind of like relational dynamics, and then actually then maybe do this work of transformation that you talk about so much. And so there is this imperative, I think, to return, right, to the world below, because you can never fully escape it, right? And I think that this novel really shows for us that it's impossible to fully escape the world, and we have to live in it, right? And so I think a lot of those transformations have to happen among ourselves with the help of all of our networks of support and everything. But yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I find this concept really important because I would love to just escape and be in that other world. And I think we do a lot of work around reimagining with perinatal healthcare. And one of the things that comes up for me is centering pregnancy, where or group antenatal care, group prenatal care, where you're in a group, you're sharing power, there's collective care, there's a platform for whatever you want to talk about, from all the things outside of health. You can talk about your liberation, you can talk about your dreams, you can dance, you can do all these things that we don't consider part of traditional care. So it is like creating this escape, this wonderful space of sort of freedom and liberation, which is wonderful. And yet we still have to contend with the world that we enter after we leave group prenatal care. And often you might be in a wonderful group, but say you get to the hospital and the providers from your group aren't there, you might be experiencing that world below. And so I think just that call to, like, we have to extend our utopia, our happy places out into the world below. We can't just leave them there. Yeah.
And that's when then the last term, the healing and the repair can take place. And when it's actually also difficult, right? Like, that's why I really was emphasizing the fact that a lot of those attempts at reimagining care are not always easy to formulate, right? Like, there's a lot of trying, there's a lot of failing, there's a lot of like tiptoeing around. And so healing and repair, for me, in the work that I do, is basically through storytelling. I think that storytelling does not have to be just restricted to novels, right? It can also be any forms of storytelling, any forms of amplification of marginalized voices, marginalized experiences, any form of reimagining. And I think this is where I really see the power of literature, and literature, again, in this broad understanding. And that's what I was hoping to show, is really that it's not limited just to textual forms, but visual forms as well, any forms of narratives that would actually, I think, already formulate or elucidate those forms of repair for us. And I really think that there is a lot that's happening on the level of narratives, that's a lot that's happening on the level of storytelling, and there's a lot of potential for repair and healing through and with those texts.
Beautiful. Yes, I love this one too. And it's so important. And I think one of, like, the key steps in your decolonizing, instructions that you're helping to give us. And I think it reminds me that we have to do a lot of internal work. We have to decolonize ourselves and extend that outside into our world, and how we really interact and collaborate with each other, and what we create and build in this real world. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So that's the second part of this conversation. The third act, I guess, and probably the one that's more interactive, is what comes now. And so we're hoping to, of course, like, leave time for a formal Q&A, I guess, but the idea would be to think with you about the place of care in your lives, how you imagining yourself, how you situate yourself within those networks, those chains of care. And so we have imagined some questions for you. So what do you care about, or who do you care for? Where do you situate yourself within forms, networks, or chains of care? And which of these concepts that you have here on the left related to care resonates most with you? And so I think we were hoping to first share maybe what that means to us, to kind of like lead the way, I guess. And then hopefully, like, maybe break into small groups of conversation to have you reflect on what we have presented to you.
And then we'll come back together and you can share and ask questions.
So, so when I think about care within my life, I guess I think a lot through my work. So I think the care that I have for the students in the class, but also my level of codependency. I have a lot of codependencies, and I think a lot of care means to recognize your codependency, because I mean, the classroom is a very humbling space for that. And I always tell my students that I can never go anywhere without them. And that is my first level of dependency, because I need to think with them and through them. And so I think that is my first understanding of care. And then, of course, they can think within smaller structures. And I think about the care that I have within my own relationships, right? So like the kind of dependencies I have within my family, in my relationships with friends, with partners, with colleagues as well, right? Like the forms of accountability and responsibility. And I think a lot of care is about responsibility, individual and collective, and that is about recognizing your place within those chains of responsibilities. And so that is where I guess I'm just like kind of like putting together 1 and 2. And about the concepts, the ones that really resonate with me, I think would be really this diagonal here and caring and healing, because I'm always thinking through forms of oppression, forms of neglect, and always trying to elucidate healing and repair. And I do this, I think, on a very individual level. I'm trying to do this even like in terms of like the types of neglect or violence that I've experienced and ways to maybe extract myself from the weight of this form of violence. And so I think uncaring and healing and repair would probably be the 2 concepts that speak to me more directly. Yeah.
Thanks. And I would say for me, lots of things that I care about. I think I shared some of those already. I think I sit in a space of wanting to care for the people I care for as a midwife and for my community, myself, and feeling very challenged in that, and able to not always able to give the care that I would like to give. And so trying to navigate that. And so I situate myself in the role of a healthcare provider in terms of that, and as a midwife, and also as someone who I think as a Black woman delivering care in this system, there's often that sense of sometimes you can feel oppressed, or feel that someone sort of sees your care as in a more colonial relationship, as something you owe them, as opposed to really respecting you. And then the world below is where I feel most challenged and trying to navigate more effectively. All right. So we'd like if you all would get in maybe groups of 3, maybe include someone you don't know, and talk for a few minutes about these questions, about these concepts, and then we're going to come back together, think about how they apply to your life, to your decolonizing journey, and then we'll come back. All right. We'll do maybe like 10 minutes or so. All right. We're going to come back together. Thank you all for talking with each other about these concepts. So we're going to come back together and take our micro conversation out and share it more broadly. And so what we'd like to do, and I'll walk around with the mic, is ask you what, if anything, stood out from your conversation with your small group, maybe what resonated with you, and also what questions do you have for Jennifer? What else do you want to know about her work? All right. Oh.
Care work is so personal to I think women. Yeah. So when we talk about care work, there's always so many things that come up. And I think that when we think about the parallels or just French Caribbean, Africa, everywhere else, even just here in America, and we think about even the specific groups that you mentioned when it comes to race, immigration, care work is highly unappreciated and ignored. in so many spaces. So with that context and just with that similarity and familiarity that we do have with that, I was just wondering if in the work of reimagining, as you're thinking about reimagining care and reimagining protections for this work, have you thought about, do you engage or in your book suggest policies that could protect this care work and make sure that it's valued enough, even in the in the space of the home, how it's not valued, and a lot of care work is unpaid. For me, my rebellious act is if I choose, or for women in my life who choose to be full-time stay at home, no, homemakers, I call it homemakers, that work has to be compensated and there has to be structures around that. So thinking about that, and also if do you think about advocacy or the place of protests in work like this, to just also to say enough is enough and this is what we are demanding in terms of care for to advance the work, and as well as when we think about education as well, if without compromising the history and in this care work and showing how much there has been injustice on it, but also just reframing stories in a way that shows the strength, but showing a balance that does not also just forward that resilience, but to show that these are people and this is what we do and this is how we need to be cared for in the same way, and how we must be protected and valued.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question and comment. Actually, speaking of advocacy, I think a lot of the advocacy, for me at least, would happen at the level of pedagogy, right? So like that would be about the space that I have, and the spaces that I have are within the institutional framework that have its limitations, and we see them increasingly in this current administration, right? But like the fact that you can actually use that space to start spreading and telling and retelling stories from different perspectives, highlighting different experiences and voices. And so I think the classroom could be a space that actually become highly political in that sense, in the curriculum that you build, in the corpus that you propose, in the strategies that you also propose to your students, and like that they also bring to the table, because also coming from like their different perspectives and their different experiences so far as well. So I think advocacy for me would start at that level. And then to go back to like the question of policies, for instance, when you look at the reparative discussions that you find in the kind of legal sphere, you find a lot of those conversations happening currently, but they're usually very unsatisfying when it comes to reparations. Like I'm thinking, for instance, of like financial reparation when it comes to the case of contamination, pollution in Guadeloupe and Martinique, where it's been, I think, the third or fourth like plan that they've had to try to seek actual like financial reparation to then like do the work of like decontamination, of depollution, of like to continue living and not basically like consuming food and like water that's polluted. And so it's always kind of like wrestling with institutional forces, wrestling with governments. And I think and again, I'm not in like political sciences. I mean, I guess I could be defined as an activist from the spaces where I speak, but a text that I like to go back to is called the Care Manifesto. And that's a text that actually, even if it's very white-centered, Western-centered, it's a text that tries to architect like governments, caring states. What does it mean for a state to be caring? So what does it mean for an economy to be caring? I mean, like, I don't know, like they seem to be antagonistic sometimes. But it's basically trying to like create those little like laboratory spaces. And I think that could be the work of advocacy. But then that would be for like people maybe in those specific areas of work, right? But I think that it's interesting to see how you could basically bridge those different spaces to come up with active solutions when it comes to like, not just, hey, let's visibilize, because visibilizing or integrating stories is not just, I don't think integration of like voices is necessarily a work of decoloniality, because I think integration is not necessarily meaning decoloniality. what you need is to disturb, what you need is to challenge. And so I think the fact that rebellious care is a term that speaks to you probably speaks to the fact that that is what needs to happen, right? So like this idea of like interfering, disturbing, reclaiming, reconquering. I've actually just come across with a Brazilian friend who was here a couple of weeks ago. She told me that a term that she finds a lot in Brazil is the idea of reconquista. So the idea of like reconquête, basically, which is where the decolonial is situating for her. And that would be basically like even just on the level of like reimagining affect. So she's talking a lot about like decolonizing affects, for instance, decolonizing the way we approach relationships. So for instance, like moving away from monogamy or like kind of like very kind of possessive relationships that would be inherited from a Western colonial model. So like that is all of those spaces, I think, that would be spaces for advocacy, right? Not necessarily like political lawmakers. I mean, of course they matter, but that's not just that, I think. Thanks.
Go here.
And I think I just would like to add to sort of this sort of same concept where, and sort of similarly, is that you can have like a local effect, you can have sort of the systemic effect. Sort of with this world below that we live in is this big system that we're sort of, we talk about political sciences, this sort of administration, sort of like banging our head against the wall every day, trying to make effects. But I think what we don't understand is a lot of times, even from a local impact, that those things do eventually affect the larger system. With time, it might not be in our lifetime, but it might be our kids' lifetimes, it might be their lifetime. And I think that as time moves on, we are seeing this sort of change. So it's one thing. And then another thing I would like to say is something you said that actually very much so resonated with me, which was I'm a nurse anesthetist. And you sort of mentioned that when you are giving care to a patient, that it's sort of like that there's this relationship that's almost something that's owed to you or owed to them, right? And I feel like with my female colleagues, this is a very similar concept that I encounter a lot as well. Like when they walk in the room, it's almost like, oh, you're expected to give me this care. Where when I walk into the room, it's almost like, oh, you're doing this incredible thing for me, right? And it's sort of like even just this very basic, like women are expected to care, whereas I'm sort of like doing this like really extravagant, philanthropic. And I'm like, no. Honestly, they're doing a better job than I am 9 times out of 10. And the fact that you think I am, it says something about this system. I had other thoughts, but I lost them. They'll come back to me, I promise. They always do.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chase.
Thank you so much for the conversation. My name is Fresha Kago. I am from Kenya, Masters of Law student at the main campus, at the law campus, sorry. And I was really excited by this conversation because I was sharing with my team. My thesis is on looking at migrant domestic workers in the Middle East and the place they occupy, and also trying to figure out the protection that they are owed by our governments, in terms of protection when they are in the Middle East. And so as the conversation went along, even though you are not speaking necessarily on labor, I could see each and every single of those aspects applying to them. Because I'm coming from a country that, or rather for most of you, Africa is the youngest continent in the world. Majority of our population, over 60% of our population is the youth. And by that, our youth, we define them as people below the age of 35. So what has happened is that in recent times, we have a ballooning population and not enough jobs that can be absorbed within the economy. So what governments have slowly started to do is to export labor to different countries. So some countries have better labor system than others, but when it comes to the Middle East in particular, it is completely problematic for women because the Middle East has what we call the kafala system. So if women migrate, especially as domestic workers, because governments are also trying to figure out, because it's a competition in terms of migration and the labor sending, because Africa has 54 countries. So what is happening is when they migrate to these countries, they are outside the protection of the labor system. So your protection, once you have a contract, you're completely at the mercy of your employer. So, and now you can imagine within our systems where we are, it's easy to file a complaint. It's not necessarily easy, but the framework exists. So when these women especially get there. I was sharing with them that part of my research I'm finding is, A, you sign a contract at home, but by the time you land, you're given a different contract. It has different terms. You work Monday to Sunday for the entire duration of your contract. If you try to leave, your employer, majority of the time is they're taken in or they're reported as if they're absconding because they have already been indentured, because majority of them, either their employer paid money to get them there, paid their fees and all of these agent fees and all of these things. So they have to work to, first of all, pay all this debt that they have accrued, and then they can try to start earning. But even what they're earning is minimal, because sometimes it is less than $300 in a month. So when you look within this system, and what we are finding as the tension is our governments consistently, or right now it is a tension between, let us send them because we are getting remittances as a country, and remittances have now overtaken a lot of the rest of the industries in terms of the monies that is flowing into the economy. So it is, and every single time we bring in the issue of protection, the government wants to tread lightly, again, lack of political will, because this is where they're getting the money. And it is also to them a way of showing the citizen that, hey, we promised the youth jobs and we are sending them in thousands. So for women, for men, it might work because where they're working is systems as maybe you're a taxi driver, you're working in a hotel, you're working as a mechanic. Within that framework, there is a contract. But for women who work as migrant domestic workers, they are completely vulnerable. And I think for majority of us, we're not aware of this until we saw it in Qatar during the World Cup. And I think that sort of opened the eyes of the world to what is happening. So I'm glad that Saudi Arabia is currently set for 2034, right?
Yeah.
Is it 2034? I don't watch football, so please say yes. 20 something, but it's on the list of the countries that is supposed to host one of these events. And so there has been a campaign that has started for us to try and get them, or actually to get them to lose the hosting for purposes of that framework. But I think within that, I could easily situate the uncaring. And again, it is flowing from the idea that it is women's job to take care of their homes, take care of their family, take care of all of this. And that is the tension. The reason they go is not really for themselves, but it is because of their families. And even the rebelliousness now for them, the framework does not give them much wiggle room, because once you're there, it's really not protecting you. And you don't have much. So the most they can do is try and keep in touch with each other, try and find mechanisms of protecting themselves. So their world below is, it's really not a happy one. So their healing and repair, I think, is for the rest of us who are within the advocacy spaces to really figure out how to protect them, keep highlighting the issues that they're facing. But I really loved the parallel between what it is you're doing and seeing how it can be applied to other economies or other areas outside of what it is your book was speaking about.
Thank you so much for this testimony. Actually, I heard also that it's very racialized and nation-based. So like apparently in Qatar, like they have pools of workers coming from the Philippines, from Kenya a lot also. And then like those situations of basically kidnapping where you're just like kept within the home, where they take your papers, limit your mobility. And that kind of like resonated in like a more distant history, which is the state-controlled migration that I was talking about, where in a lot of cases they would call it voluntary migration because there was a lot of unemployment in the French Caribbean in the 60s, 70s. And so those young people, a lot of them women, would move, and actually they had no social mobility because they were sent to a training school to become basically domestics. They would then be literally hired by white bourgeois families and then usually live like as lived-in maids. And they were like basically, I mean, barely paid to take care of the family. And they had very little money to be able to then return home. So that's also creating situations of exile and like intense isolation where you find yourself unable to actually connect with your community. So like you really see that there is a pattern, like a colonial pattern through all of those situations. It's actually, I guess, hopeful to hear that some advocacy is happening, at least in the case of the Middle East, because there's so much, I think, modern slavery happening there.
Thank you. I want to be mindful of our time. This is such a good discussion, and I think exactly what we wanted to happen is starting to happen. I love that you referred to your group as a team because hopefully we can connect with each other and maintain some of these connections. I really appreciate that folks have shared their work and what they're doing and what they care about. And I know there are lots of synergies here. And so maybe out of this, we can generate more action towards decolonizing care. And we tried to decolonize the book talk by not just making it a sort of everyone ask questions and just have a presenter, but really we want to really amplify all of the expertise and energy in this space. And we're glad you all got to connect with each other.